We've already been talking for what, like an hour, it feels like. And basically the topic was around I wanted Colton to help me come up with more like concise like definitions or explanations of what we believe about certain topics in theology and philosophy. And the one I was picking his brain about is the nature of decision making. And as we went through it and described it, it almost sounded like, to me, what Colin was describing is if we were all perfectly reasonable creatures, we would be essentially making the same decisions. Um, and obviously, that's not the case because you can have perfectly reasonable people make different decisions about something. So, I think what we got to is that even if your reasons are perfect, you still filter those reasons through your knowledge about the world, your experiences in life so far, and your disposition given your DNA makeup, preferences, all that sort of stuff. So you make decisions based off of what hopefully we'll describe more clearly: moderate reasons responsiveness filtered through your knowledge, experiences, and disposition. And that is going to equal your decision or what you decide to do. So the goal now, hopefully very quickly, because there's a lot of topics we want to get to, is defining as concise as we possibly can what moderate reasons responsiveness means in very plain English, hopefully. So Colton, help us figure this crap out. I haven't read this far in Preciado's book yet.
So moderate reasons responsiveness is a technical philosophical term that Fisher and Revisa, two philosophers on moral responsibility, tried to, I guess, invent, philosophize about in order to kind of goad our intuitions on how we attribute moral responsibility to people. And they try to say or argue that the reason why someone is morally responsible is because they have what we call guidance control. We guide our beliefs in such a way that we have control of them. So they don't say that we have control over them, our beliefs, our reasons, and junk, but and what we think and what we do, but we have control of them. Part of guidance control is this, which Mez said, moderate reasons responsive. If I am responsive to reasons for doing something, then I could be held responsible for it. They contend it's both a necessary and sufficient condition for it. So, without getting into the whole philosophical jargon, although I would love that, and maybe we could do that at a separate podcast episode, explaining it and reading it exactly philosophically how they would explain it. Just briefly, there's three parts to moderate reasons responsiveness. The first part is I need to be strongly or regularly receptive to reasons. So, in other words, I need to make sure I have reasons coming in my brain. So,
So you have to
so
not
be,
be brain dead.
right. So you have to be able to be aware of reasons that you have. Like I have good reason. Well, I shouldn't say good, perhaps, but I think it's good. But and now be more of an introduction of what we're going to talk next. But I have reason to drink a Red Bull here because I'm tired.
What?
I'm a little sleepy. So I drink a Red Bull to kind of boost my energy. I also have reason to do it sugar free because I hate sugar in my drinks. Destroys my teeth really, really fast. My dentist is going to get mad. So I try to do as least sugar as possible, even though we all know Red Bull is extremely bad for you. But those reasons to me outweigh my other reasons. All that to say, do I know reasons coming in my brain? Do I have reasons? Yeah. Whether or not they're good reasons, that's a totally different scenario, which we're going to talk about next. But at least I'm receptive to reasons. Good.
In what case would you not be receptive to reasons? Like if you are
You're brain dead.
blind or like
If
can't
you're brain
hear?
dead, if you're hardened of heart, if you're manipulated. So like Pharaoh, I don't think was receptive to reasons. Like specifically at like the 10th plague. Come on, dog.
Yeah.
You had 9 reasons, 9 reasons to give up the people, and yet you didn't. So that kind of when someone is particularly just they just or a drunk driver, those
Well,
kinds of people are
what
not receptive to reasons.
what's the threshold? Do you just have, because obviously we're not receptive to all reasons. We have to be
Right?
receptive
We're
to
receptive to reasons.
some
That's the third
reasons, to
condition.
most reasons, to
That's a, I'm gonna skip
okay.
one and go to the third.
So let's just, first one is you're receptive
Receptive to
to reason, just in a general sense. That could be one reason or one bit of
5,
information
10
or a
for
bunch of
me.
information.
Right. So I'm gonna skip to the third because you asked a good question. The third one is those reasons need to be grounded in reality, a stable pattern of my own disposition. And so we're going to talk about that. Shemez and I just talked about it like 30 minutes ago, but it's stable in my own disposition and character. So, for instance, I never get drunk. Never been drunk. And I don't ever plan to get drunk. And when I drink, I know exactly when I'm about to stop. And so when I'm about to, like, I can feel like, okay, this is getting kind of heavy, so I'll stop. Now, if I just one day my wife comes in, I'm just blackout drunk, like wasted. My wife would not be like, "Oh, that's just a typical day for
There he
Colton."
goes again.
Just pull the blankets over me and be like, "Nighty night." Wipe my chin. No, what she's gonna do instead is she gonna be like, "Holy crap, like what happened?" She's gonna actually think something like severe happened to me to
She'd,
either
she'd
A,
probably
like
assume you
me.
had like a heart attack before getting drunk or something like that.
Right. Because it wasn't stable in my disposition. It wasn't grounded in reality. My reasons for getting are not even part of my threshold. They're not even part. So you asked like, what's the threshold there? That's one reason. Like if I ingrain something in my disposition so much so that's not even part of my grounded in reality pattern of sanity, then I'm not going to consider it. Like I'm not going to consider a reason slapping my kid in the face. There's no reason that comes in my mind whatsoever to slap my kid in the face, even if they're like yelling at me. And my daughter's like a year and a half, so she
You
can't.
say that now. No, I'm just kidding.
But for right now, though, for right now, I have no reason to slap her in the face, right? And if I did, my wife would literally be like, "What is going on?" Like she wouldn't think like, "How dare you?" She would probably think, "That's really odd. What causes you to do that?" Like it wouldn't be like her reactive attitude towards me wouldn't necessarily automatically be disgust.
Are
It
you
would
giving
be
me?
kind of
Okay,
concern.
I get you're giving me a lot of examples, but say it like precisely. I think you already did. Just repeat yourself, if nothing else.
Third condition is that my reasons, my threshold needs to be grounded in my own disposition, stable from my own human person. So I'm not going to consider a reason that is outside of my own
I feel
disposition.
like there's a better way to say that. That's not bad. Like you mostly get the point, but your example helped me understand it a lot more than your definition did, and it shouldn't. We want the definition to reflect the example, not be sound entirely different. But I don't know what to tell you for, because it sounds like a normal pattern of like
Behavior.
your reality, or normal pattern of behavior, or normal pattern of something along those lines, because it's not exactly only behavior. um
Or how about this? Let's go to step number 2.
Reality seems
It's a
too broad.
normal it's a normal pattern of reaction to reasons.
Normal pattern of reaction to
Because
reasons.
the last, technically it's number 2, but the last condition for moderate reasons responsiveness is reacting to reasons, weakly reacting to reasons. Like you are going to choose out of those however many reasons you were initially receptive to, you're going to choose one reason or multiple reasons, whatever. Reasons are going to dictate weakly react. You're gonna react to those reasons in a way that leads to action, that leads to choice, and so forth.
And those choices
So
are going to be consistent to your
those
normal.
choices are going to be consistent and grounded to normal behavior, normal a normal disposition, how you normally act. Like, I don't normally get drunk.
Yeah.
So
So
my threshold for reasons, I'm never going to consider getting drunk. That's not going to be my receptive to reasons.
the example makes it very clear, but I'm trying to get the definition to be just as clear, which it is very good. Like it's very good. Like normal pattern of behavior, it'll be consistent with your disposition, it'll be consistent with your normal pattern of behavior, be consistent with your reality in a sense.
How Fisher and Revisa normally, or how Fisher normally describes it, is that that your behavior or your reaction to those reasons is grounded in reality, stable through a normal pattern or an understandable pattern. That's usually the two words that they tend to use: understandable pattern, grounded in
Okay, hold
reality.
on. Let's throw that out. Let's throw that out because I think we can use our earlier definition to help us get there here. So let's just start from the beginning, though. The first point, moderate reasons responsiveness. You have to be responsive to reason in some way, shape, or form. Point two would be those reasons have to be. I'm lost here. Those reasons, help me out here. First point is you have to be responsive to reason. Second point is
The second point is technically weakly reaction to those reasons.
that means nothing to me. We need something better than that.
So you're just reacting to those reasons, and
I get that, but why weakly? Like, what do you mean weakly reacting?
so weakly is a word that they use to designate that you're not reacting to all reasons for doing something. You're reacting to a reason in which is a good reason for you in that sequence and in your decision making process.
So would it be easy to say that your reaction to the reasons to the that make
So think of it like a
the
funnel.
most sense to you?
Yeah, so think of like a funnel. Top, first condition, tons of reasons funneling into your brain. That's receptive to reasons. And then as it kind of slims down, that's when the weak part comes in.
Can we
So
stop using that word? Use a different word.
well,
I know that's what I know. I know it's annoying.
but they're just saying it in such a way that they're breaking.
I know what I'm asking is very annoying and difficult.
Yeah, but I'm probably just not going to follow you because I think there's some things you need to be specific. They're taking, how they describe it is they're taking an asymmetrical claim. What that means is they're not similar. So your receptivity and your reaction to those reasons are not similar. What does that mean? It means that the mechanism of reasons responsiveness engages your receptivity to reasons differently than how it engages your reaction to those reasons. So that's why they use strong receptivity to reasons as compared to weak reactivity. So it's they call it an asymmetrical claim, and the reason why they call it is because of that funnel. Because if I was like, I'm strongly receptive to reasons and I'm strongly reactive to those reasons, then that means I would react to all of those reasons all at once.
They would all
That's
be
just
equally considered,
right. They would all
and
be
they're
equally
not.
considered and also equally reacted to.
Okay,
That's not
okay.
clearly not the case.
So the second point is almost like all of these reasons they all don't have the same weight. Let's just call it that.
Right.
So you're receptive to all reasons, but some of those reasons, or one of those reasons, are, I don't know if you're just like, is it the reason you're deciding to pay the most attention to? Is it the reason that
Um,
is leading you to action? Like, so could I say one of those reasons is I don't know
it,
how to say it.
it's just like there's sufficient reason to do otherwise. That's really what it means. Like there's just sufficient reason to do that thing. I recognize that reason as a good reason. I choose and do that thing for that reason. Um,
So you're receptive to all reasons. One of those reasons you choose, or one of those reasons you perceive to be sufficient enough for an action. Okay, how does that lead into the third point, which I already forgot because I'm an idiot?
it's just that it's grounded in reality. It's an understandable pattern.
Okay, so you're perceptive to reasons. What are those reasons become sufficient? Are all perceptive reasons, one of those
So
reasons
think of it
becomes the
like
sufficient reason. And
one
that
of the
sufficient reason has to be
grounded in
consistent,
reality,
grounded in
consistent in
your
reality.
reality, your
Yeah,
reality.
your subjective personhood. Yes.
Okay, and then
So
so is that third point kind of what I was explaining at the beginning? Like those reasons are filtered through your knowledge, experiences, and disposition. Like how, where does that part of the puzzle come into? Is that the correct place to put it, or is it after?
um, I don't. I think number three is flexible. But you can put it either before or at the end. But I think it's needed. So
Yeah, I think
whenever
it's needed
I,
too.
I think of it like I said, like a funnel, or better yet, even like making coffee. Like your coffee could be the reason, like the strong reasons, like your literal coffee grounds that you put into like coffee, whatever, and then the water pours through it. That's like the mechanism, and then what comes out? Coffee. That is your when the
Okay.
water hits the coffee. That's the reaction part. It's reacting to reasons, and then what comes out is the understandable way, like grounded in reality. So your reaction is like your ability to translate reasons into choices. Like
Okay.
take your receptive reasons, all the reasons that you're receptive to, you're actually engaging with them in such a way to actually translate them into choices. That's the second reaction part. And then you
Mm-hmm.
react. How do you react? In what way does it come out? Well, it's grounded in your own disposition. So it's going to be something in which you could see me plausibly doing. It's nothing like
Okay. So
insane for me to do.
it might be redundant, but we could explain it like the first the first thing is you're receptive to all reasons, and then it gets filtered. Those reasons get filtered by your knowledge, experiences, and disposition, which leads to some or one or whatever. I'm just going to say some of those reasons become sufficient for you, sufficient enough for action. How do you say that? Sufficient enough.
Sufficient enough to translate that reason to a choice, and that choice then to an action. These
And that,
choices come before action, right?
okay, so that choice, so we're not quite there yet. So that choice would have to be consistent with your understanding of reality.
From my own dispositional structure. It is rooted in my dispositional environment, experience.
Grounded, yeah, like based on your reality, and then it gets translated into an action. So it's like those three things have to like click before the mechanism goes forward. So you have to
For
take in
completion to
reasons.
the mechanism. The mechanism has already gone forward. For the mechanism to be completed, for you to go from reasons to choice, that those three conditions need to be met. Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
So much fun.
no, this is great. I love this actually. But I think I got it now. So you have to be receptive to reasons. Some of those reasons are sufficient, and those sufficient reasons have to be grounded in your reality, or those sufficient reasons have to be consistent with your knowledge, experience, and disposition.
Yeah.
And that leads to your action.
Your choice.
Your choice. Okay. Where's the action coming? So we have our choice figured out.
So the choice is just you. I'm deciding to get drunk.
Okay.
And then action is literally, I mean, your bodily movements just moving, your will being connected to that choice to actually bring something about. You can think of it like temptation, and then actually like going through with the temptation or something like that.
So
Like
all of that we basically described a formation of a desire to do, and then the second part would be to do that. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I want to say, Colton, or if you ask me, I'm your student, this is the end of the semester test. What is the nature, like how do people decide to do things? I think you have to be receptive to reasons. Some of those reasons have to be sufficient enough to, I want to say like have to be sufficient enough to act on. Would that be fair? Or you perceive some of those reasons to be sufficient enough?
Sufficient to do. Sufficient, yeah. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters.
I think I want to say sufficient enough to act on. I'm just going to leave it at that. So you have to perceive reasons. Some of those reasons are sufficient enough to act on. And those reasons are consistent with your experience, your knowledge about the world, and your disposition. And that produces the desire to do an action, and then you act on that action. But even that, it's not just that simple, because your desire to act and what you actually do can be two separate things. So there's factors going into what you're able to do. And I always think of the examples like there's a lot of people that have the desire to like become rich, and the best way they think they could get there is maybe by stealing. But there's reasons people don't steal. I guess that would actually go into the nature of decision making. Let's just say you have a desire to date this girl, but she's out of town. She had to go visit family who are sick that weekend. So your desire to do something doesn't equal an action per se all the time. Would that be fair? Like there's limiting factors on, just because you desire to do something doesn't mean you're going to act it out in that same way that you desired.
Right, but that would be from step 1 to step 2. So receptivity to weak reaction.
So you would have to go through the process again to produce a different desire, because your reception of reasons have now changed.
Yeah.
Oh, never step in the same river twice type of thing. So it's not that there's limiting factors on.
They stipulate Fisher and Revisa, the philosophers who have articulated this theory. They've stipulated that this literally applies to like all decisions, pretty much.
Yeah.
Like every single decisions in which we are at least morally responsible for. They take it. I don't agree with them with this, but they take it that some actions are just amoral, so there's like morally neutral. So
yeah,
you don't necessarily need to have a moderate reasoned responsiveness mechanism going through you in order to make those kinds of decisions. But decisions in which you could be morally responsible for, they say yes. So those moral reasons, they treat that as like moral reasons. Now, Me, I don't know about you. I think you disagree. I think all reasons lead to moral choices. I think any choice is a moral choice in one way or another. So I think you can apply it to every single like every single decision all the way through.
I agree you can apply it to every decision, but every decision is not moral.
We will agree to disagree.
Okay, I'm going to have to poop before I go to bed tonight. And my reasons for pooping are natural, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So I sit on the toilet and poop.
Yep.
Is that a moral decision to go poop in the toilet?
Are you doing it to the glory of God?
No, I'm doing it to empty my bowels.
I take a strong literal interpretation of Corinthians 10:31, which says, no matter what you do, whether it's eat or drink, you do all for the glory of God.
Or poop?
Yeah, so, yeah, like, actually. Now, someone can say, like, well, you never probably go pee or poop for the glory of God. Yeah, probably. Yeah, you got me. I'm a sinner. Oh. That doesn't negate my point.
What would
The
that look
point
like, though,
is
Colton? How do you
that
poop to the
all
glory of God?
choices and decisions could be rooted back to if you're glorifying God or not.
How do you glorify God by pooping?
I think I'm not sure. I've thought about it a lot, but I don't
How
think,
do
and
you
Paul wasn't even clear on it either.
How do you glorify God by wiping? I think that's an easier question. Because
I think
cleanliness
those
is close to
decisions, though,
godliness.
so those decisions aren't necessarily voluntary decisions. Those decisions are
Oh,
involuntary because we just naturally go through the process.
yes.
Just kind of be maybe we can be more responsible for the
Peeing in
voluntary
the
decisions we think while pooping or
peeing
peeing.
in the correct designated area. 'Cause we could just willy nilly just
That
pee
that to me
wherever.
though is that to me is a voluntary thing. Like we naturally just because potty training, we're just naturally
Yeah.
peeing where we need to pee, so or pooping where we need to poop, or wiping where we need to wipe. So all of that is voluntary or involuntary, and I don't know if we can necessarily be morally responsible for involuntary things.
Well, amoral, involuntary, potato. Is
But when we first learned it, whether we knew it or not, maybe if we first, I sure hope you were potty trained before you were actually a prime candidate to be considered morally praiseworthy or blameworthy, like at 2 or 3. Like no one's going to consider a 2 or 3-year-old blameworthy or praiseworthy candidate, right?
I am
So
very
when
I
you
blame
first
my
learn how
3-year-old
to do
all
that
the time.
stuff, when you first learn how to do that stuff, it was all like almost in like God doesn't necessarily look at you and react to you in a praiseworthy or blameworthy way because you were not reasons responsive to begin with. You were just going through a training program. So now it's all before you even started having memories. You're potty trained, I hope. But if that's the case, then you're going to pee and poop and do all those monotonous things, involuntary actions. But let's just say I think a sinful act when I'm pooping. Well, I could be morally responsible for that because it could be voluntary.
Yeah, I guess so. Because you could always apply like moral, I don't know, brownie points to your thought life, regardless of what you're doing. I could run with you on that angle for sure. I don't think
So yeah, I think your question is, can we glorify God while pooping? And
no, but you
kind
can
of, but it's not like I think we have to do a little bit more philosophizing. Like,
you
it
could
was
say
voluntary
many a great
or
hymnals have been written on the pooper. I'm sure of that.
not.
So, but no, I get you. Like at least for me, I have a very robust thought life, so I could easily be thinking of God knows what while pooping.
Right, and I think those are or
Nobody,
calling because we don't
nobody,
really do
nobody only just poops and nothing else.
that. Right,
Because you're
at least not now.
scrolling, you're on Facebook, maybe a little shopping, some games.
But yeah, I'm saying like for those actions because those are voluntary actions that aren't like habitual per se. those things you could be morally responsible for, and they require a moderate, reasoned, responsive mechanism, and you can be praiseworthy or blameworthy, glorify God or not, blah, 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 blah. But with
Well,
just like actually you grunting, squeezing it out of your cheeks, that action, that
well,
thing is involuntary.
well, even like I almost feel like what you choose to wear, because I don't know why my mind always goes that when you talk about choices. Choosing to wear, at least for me, is completely involuntary. Like at my point, I know it's a voluntary choice for some people. Like they really, sit there
Right. So I
and
think
think about it. So for me, I'm like, whatever shirt hits my hand first, that's what I'm wearing that day, pretty much. If it's clean and still fits my fat stomach, I'm wearing it. So that's a pretty involuntary choice on my end. Like I don't choose between underwear. I have only one pair or one type of underwear, and that's involuntary. I'm not, choosing which one. I guess I chose which one to buy in the first place. Was that a moral choice? I don't think
But then
so.
again, like those aren't voluntary. Like you have to buy underwear.
That is
Those aren't
true. It is kind
necessarily
of
voluntary.
involuntary.
How you react to the price, or how
Yeah.
you react to if they don't have your size, stuff
Or
like that.
spending like, $100 on a pair of underwear. Is
Right.
that
Then you're
fiscally
if you're like,
responsible?
what is this BS? Okay, well then you're kind of angry, and then you're probably saying
Yeah.
so.
That I could see where that gets complicated, but I don't want to get into that. That was 30 minutes of random BS that we weren't supposed to talk about. But I'm going to re-listen to that. I think it was super helpful, like to at least wrap my head around. And that's kind of what I was telling Colton, is it'd be nice to like get these kind of concise explanations going for a wide variety of topics that deal with theology and philosophy. But that's, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like, because there's a lot of things that we're kind of working on, I guess, right now. And a few of those we're going to talk about now. So Colton, I don't know what you want to talk about. Take it away.
So I've said it in other podcasts here and there, sort of. But it's this mere Molinist dilemma that I've posited against Molinist, trying to, I think, try to squeeze their own Molinism into Reformed theology. And I don't like that because I don't think it's right. And I don't think they can do that effectively. But some dig their heels in and say, no, I can, blah, blah, blah. And so I've danced around it. I've kind of explicated it and exposited it and talked about it a little bit on podcasts here and there if you just search or Google my name. But I never like actually went through the full robust what my actual response is. In response to people saying, arguing against my first response, so let's call this a rejoinder. So I first said what my mere Molinist dilemma is in my reply to Stratton, Volume 1 on academia. And then Stratton, and not just him, but other Molinists have responded to it. And so I want to officially do a rejoinder here. And hopefully it'll kind of clear the air, make sense, and then I can just point people to this video after this 30 minutes of nonsense.
It was nonsense. I'm not gonna lie.
But and I've already explained the mere Molinist dilemma on actually on our show, I think, like episodes ago. But I'll just recap it here. Molinism first is the thesis that God has middle knowledge, knowing what free creatures would do in any circumstance. So before he created the world, he knew what Shemez would do in this circumstance or that whatever.
Did you
And
know I do
that
this?
he would know that Shemez would do that in response to me saying what middle knowledge is in this possible world.
What if I flip the
But
camera off? Would you know if I do that? Huh?
uh,
I'd take my shirt off.
the second piece is libertarian freedom. So what kind of freedom does Shemez possess in this circumstance? Libertarian freedom. So we already defined libertarian freedom. I'm not going to define it anymore. But that's the two theses for middle knowledge. Now, Some people contend, Stratton is one of them, but not the only one. Some people contend that you can take those basic two theses, middle knowledge and libertarian freedom, what we call mere Molinism, and that is compatible with Reformed theology. So, in some way, I don't think so. And there's two, and so when I originally articulated it in volume one, I basically said that you either, and I took one moment, just one, the most crucial moment, and that is the moment at salvation. So whether God determines you, because Stratton, and among others, want to say, well, God can still determine your salvation, keeping the I in tulip, irresistible grace, whatever. And you can keep all the other four letters, the total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, whatever. It's just that in everything else, you have libertarian freedom to do what you do.
Which I've always thought was
And,
BS, because if you
and
don't
in middle
have
knowledge.
libertarian freedom in that choice, then by definition, you do not have libertarian freedom.
So the idea is,
to me at least,
it gets sticky, so I'm not going to try to go through the whole dilemma, but I just kind of want to recap it. My proposal was, if you want to say that you can be determined to salvation, but not determined anywhere else, you have libertarian freedom, then my initial proposal was either A, this is what I call a dilemma, you either fall on horn A, and that you're either free or not free at that moment. If you're not free at that moment, then I don't think any Calvinist would actually say that. They're going to say that, hey, I was free in some sense at that moment of salvation. So I think he's I call that the Calvinist horn. I think he's throwing his Calvinist friends underneath the bus. That when he's determined to salvation, and if you say, at that moment, that person who's determined to salvation did not freely choose salvation, I just don't see how it's plausible that any Calvinist would say that's the case, like that I'm not free at all.
some
Because we
would say
want to
that.
we want to say that we're free, that it was our decision in some sense, but God determined it. We call that compatibilism, but he has to say incompatibilism. Stratton and others have to say that's incompatibilism. That's the first horn. So I don't see how that's plausible. Or horn B, number two, I call it the free thinking horn. Whereas usually the proponents of the mere Molinism, incompatible with Reformed theology, want to say that, argue something like the free thinking argument, which we've talked about in the past. I'm not going to go through it, but you would have to give up the fact that the free thinking argument is actually false. What that means is you have to say that the person was free. What does that mean? It means they are free and determined at the same time. Well, that just means it's compatibilism, but the free thinking argument and incompatibilism just doesn't follow. So incompatibilism is false. If incompatibilism is false, libertarianism is false. If libertarianism is false, middle knowledge is false,
You just
and so is
kick the base out from the
normal.
whole argument right there.
Right. So this dilemma, those two horns, the Calvinist horn and free thinking horn, or I guess I can modify it to the incompatibilist horn, really, or the compatibilist. It doesn't matter. But those two horns, those things kind of drive the dilemma. Now, there's been some pushback, and the primary pushback that's been about it was saying that if they're not going to, no incompatibilist is going to give up the second horn. They're not going to say that that agent was compatibilistically free. They were determined and free at the same time. They're not going to fall on that. And I'm like, okay, I already knew that. So that means they're going to fall on the first one. What that means is they're going to say, we're not actually throwing Calvinists underneath the bus. We're still trying to make some compatibility between mere Molinism and Reformed theology. The Calvinists can still hold to it. It's just the case that they're not free. But also the idea is, well, don't you, Calvinists, want to say you're morally responsible there too? Don't you want to say that you're praiseworthy for, don't you want to say that you're not praiseworthy? So the idea is, for me, I'm saying that that all Calvinists should say that they're free and morally responsible at their moment of salvation. Well, the response to the other side against me says, well, you shouldn't want to claim moral responsibility as a Calvinist, right? Because all glory goes to God, and you can't be praiseworthy if you believe. So since you can't be praiseworthy if you believe, then you should already be denying that person is free and morally responsible when they're determined. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the general pushback I get. So I just wanted to kind of clear the air and give a couple responses. I have 3, so and they're actually pretty short, and then we can just move on to whatever else, like foreknowledge or other stuff that we want to talk about. But the first response is similar to what Bignon has actually responded to, something very similar to this. So in his response to Tim Stratton on page 17, he says that they shouldn't, they meaning Calvinists at a moment of salvation when they're determined, they shouldn't accept the other side of the same coin, which is that a sinner's choice to reject the gospel cannot be blameworthy. What does that mean? What it means is, okay, if we go along with the other side, the mere Molinist side, and say, yeah, Calvinists shouldn't be praiseworthy for believing the gospel and being determined at the same time, because all glory goes to God. You can't boast, so they shouldn't claim praiseworthiness. Well, first, what Bignon says, well, if blame and praise are symmetrical, what that means is if I can't be praised for accepting the gospel, I can't be blamed for rejecting it either. But clearly that's false. Like we clearly, Calvinists, Incompatibilists, everybody blames, in some sense, uh, uh, someone who rejects the gospel, right?
The Bible
So,
blames them, so
right. So I think this is one response that someone, obviously Bignon takes it, but we think of praise and blame as part of the same coin, is what Bignon says. So, if you're going to give up praise for the Calvinist here, which I don't think you should, and I'm going to clarify that in a bit, but I think that they should be morally responsible. But if you give up the praiseworthy side, then you have to give up the blameworthy side for them rejecting the gospel. And I don't think that's plausible. That they should be morally responsible in some sense at the moment of salvation. And you can't just simply say, well, they're not free and morally responsible, so mere Molinism is still compatible with Reformed theology. I don't find that plausible. I think you need to do some more work on the praise and blame side. So that is the first point. Makes sense so far? Second point is a little bit more nuanced. Let's look at the word responsibility. Doesn't necessarily follow that if I'm morally responsible, I am praiseworthy and blameworthy. Well, I think the correct answer is no. I'm either praised or blamed. I don't know which one, right? So the idea is these moral judgments, praise and blame, are not necessarily synonymous with moral responsibility simpliciter. What that means is just moral responsibility by itself. So God can hold us morally responsible at the moment of salvation while being determined to salvation, the I in tulip, yet that doesn't necessarily mean I'm praised, right? God may not praise us at all. What we're saying is we're just prime candidates for being praised or blamed. And obviously, as a Calvinist, what I'm going to say is, well, the Spirit of God was the one who determined the salvation in the first place. He gets all the praise. But does that mean I'm not morally responsible at all? No. I'm morally responsible, but the Spirit of God in me is praised. So yes, God gets all the glory, He gets all the boasting, I get none of it. Does that mean I'm not automatically responsible? No, because moral judgments are not the same thing as responsibility. One may follow from the other, but the nature of those moral judgments needs to be clearly argued separately, like whether I'm praised in that sense or whether I'm blamed at salvation is a totally different scenario. So I think those two things are separate, so I can still be responsible, determined to salvation, free, and yet be fine. And then a subsection out of that is just get rid of responsibility if it's too difficult for people to understand. Am I free at salvation? Yes or no? Well, no. I don't see how any Calvinist would deny that personally. and this brings me to my last response. Let's just say we have a Calvinist that literally says, yep, you're right, mere Molinist people, I am not free at all during my determined salvation. God determined me, and I wasn't free at all. I find those Calvinists extremely implausible, and to the point where they're like the minority. And if that's the case, I will concede, and then I'll say, fine, mere Molinism, you can have your minority. But good luck trying to argue, as Ben Shapiro says, good luck trying to argue a minority case for a majority case. You have one small sliver of the Calvinist community. Knock yourself out.
Take them, honestly. I don't want them either.
But you can have them, because I personally, I don't even consider those Calvinists in the first place. Like, honestly. And maybe that's a no true Scotsman. I would argue historically, confessionally, and just by basic tulip that we are free, and by intuition, we all agree that we're free, even if we're determined. A compatibilist would agree with that. The Libertarian incompatibilist who's a Molinist agrees with that. The only person that would disagree with that is a hard determinist. Right? So that means you're saying a Calvinist could be a hard determinist at that moment of salvation while being determined. I just don't find those Calvinists. I find those Calvinists very slim and few and far in between. Like I don't find those Calvinists very often. And even those Calvinists, I would actually consider hyper Calvinists. Historically, they would be
Yeah.
considered hyper Calvinists, hard Calvinists, or sorry, not hard, but hyper Calvinists who just are very almost to the point where we don't need to evangelize at all, because hard determinism entails incompatibilism, which means our freedom and God's determination is not, they're mutually exclusive. What that means is even our evangelizing is like unnecessary, because God either determines them to believe or not. And again, Calvinism historically is just not that. Hard determinism entails that we're not morally responsible. Hard determinism entails that we're not free, that we're completely and utterly passive cogs, as Stratton would say all the time, and a lot of his followers. Okay, again, which Calvinist is going to actually say that? And if you say, well, I've met some, great, you can have them. I don't even consider them part of the Calvinist community. You're barking at the wrong tree. Now, you could say that's incompatibilist at the moment of salvation. It's either hard determinism, which I already say it's not plausible. It's not attractive, at least, in the very least. So I concede it. You can be a Calvinist, and you can still hold to I in a hard deterministic sense and be a mere Molinist. That doesn't make any sense to me, like at all. If you're a hard determinist in one sense, but not in others. Anyways, it's just unattractive. It's not an attractive view. The second part is you can be a hard incompatibilist. That's a little bit more nuanced, and what that means is you are still the source of your action, but it's just the case you're not free or responsible. So the hard determinist takes it a step further. You're not the source, you're not free, and you're not responsible. You're nothing. You're a passive cog. Like you're just, God's believing basically for you, is what Stratton would say. A hard incompatibilist still, though, says, okay, I agree, we're not free and responsible at salvation, but we're still the source. And that's incompatibilism. And I don't think Stratton could hold with that either, or any other mere Molinist, or any Molinist for that matter, because Molinists deny that you can be determined and still the source of your action. So they need a libertarian idea in order for it to be the source. But you can't be determined and still the source in the same sense. Only hard incompatibilism allows that, and compatibilism, which would be, to me, the robust Calvinist view. And then lastly, I guess you could hold to something what we call soft source incompatibilism, but that just is very close to the libertarian view. Whether or not you could, then that just completely gets rid of the I, because nothing's determined. So that means it's either compatibilism at the moment of salvation and incompatibilism. If it's compatibilism, you just gave up Molinism, because Molinism is not compatible with compatibilism. Molinism entails incompatibilism with regards to free will. not compatibilism with regards to free will. But if you say, yes, you're free and responsible at the moment of salvation, that's compatibilism. You just gave up Molinism. Congratulations. Calvinists win. But they're not going to do that. No Molinist is going to do that. So they're going to claim, okay, at the moment of salvation, it's incompatibilist. Okay, those are your three options. Libertarianism, which means it's not even compatible with Reformed theology because then you just gave up the I. The I needs to be determined, so you can't have that. Hard source incompatibilism, but you disagree with the fact that you can be a source and still determined at salvation, so you can't have that. Or you can have hard determinism. You're not the source, you're not free, you're not responsible. I guess that is compatible with Molinism. But good luck finding Calvinists who hold to that. So that is my overall rejoinder to my critics, I guess, responding to my mere Molinist dilemma. So all that to say, I still think the dilemma is intact.
Yeah, that all sounds good to me and makes sense. The only thing that like kind of tripped me up was um you are if you are blameworthy for something, that must mean that you're also praiseworthy for something. Like, so if you're
Nice.
blameworthy for not being saved, then you should be praiseworthy for being saved. I Yeah, to me that even like assigning a moral judgment onto the act of being salvation and or getting salvation in the first place is almost unheard of in the Bible. At what point are people being praised for believing in God necessarily? Like, I mean, the guy on the cross, next to Jesus was like, I forget what he said, but Jesus like, you'll be out, in heaven with me after this. But he
Right.
wasn't praised necessarily, or like the woman at the well, like, go and sin no more, like your sins are forgiven, something along those lines. I don't see him praising people. I see him forgiving people, and I see him
Right.
transforming people. But you don't see God praising people. And to me, when we want to think about moral assignment to an action, as far as humans are concerned, we are all guessing. If we want to assign moral, what would it be? What would it call? Praiseworthy or blameworthy, whatever you want to call it. This is us guesstimating what God might do. We don't really know. So ultimately, it's in God's eyes, we know for a fact from the Bible that we are blameworthy for it. And as far as being praiseworthy for it, I don't see any evidence of that in the Bible. So to me, it's pretty clear. Like it's a moot point before it even is a point to begin with, because it's
Well,
not
the thing,
shown
the
in the
only reason why I
Bible.
bring it up is because usually, not always, but usually incompatibilists are the ones who bring up what we call symmetrical freedom. I'm praised for something, I'm blamed for the opposite coin. So if I'm praised for doing that, that means I'm blamed for not doing that.
Yeah.
Usually, not always. And I think that there is, and that's what I think Bignon's point is. Bignon's point is just kind of like a small jab, like, well, that doesn't seem plausible because underneath your own view, it should be symmetrical or something along those lines. And I agree with you. I actually just had a conversation with Finney Raju. You remember him?
Yeah.
So Finney's a bright guy. He's in our
I
debate.
like Finney a lot. He's a cool dude.
Yeah, he's a cool dude. I've had many conversations with him, and I was kind of explaining this almost verbatim. I said exactly what you said, that I really don't see anyone praised in the Bible for believing. And then other people have said, well, they say, well done, thy good and faithful servant. And I'm just like, let me rephrase. Can you see anybody praised in the Bible apart from the Holy Spirit? And the answer is just straight no. Like, it's no. Like, you don't see that at all. Now,
No.
you do see people praised, I guess, if I'm going to use that word loosely, with the Spirit, right? Or even in the Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11,
Yeah.
right?
It's
The Hall
counted
of Fame of faith,
faith. Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, all those people had the Spirit of God. So who's actually praised? Them? Nah, the Spirit of God. And so I was trying to explain that to them, but I was explaining exactly what you said. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, well, and I'm kind of playing around with this idea, so don't crucify me too much. Maybe God doesn't blame anybody. maybe God doesn't blame necessarily anybody. And that is an idea that's actually becoming pretty prominent in the philosophical community.
What do you mean by that?
And
What do you mean by
I
that?
have no idea because I'm just now studying it.
Let let
So.
me let me let me muse on this for a second.
But I think it's interesting because if that's the case, well then, yeah, Calvinists can really wholeheartedly deny all that charge, like
Okay,
all
well,
these charges.
I have a baby idea. Don't crucify me. Not allowed to crucify babies. Um, but I've always thought that like people are always like, oh, if you're not a believer, you go to hell. Like God sends you to hell. Like, oh, if you're a Calvinist, that means God predetermined you to burn in the lake of fire for eternity. Whatever your regardless version of eternity is, doesn't matter. But God determined you to be there. And I've always thought of hell as like, well, hell to me was the place God created for the demons and for the people like Satan and blah, blah, blah. And I feel like non believers just end up there for lack of another place to be just in general. Because it's not like you're being sent to hell, you're just not being sent to heaven. So it's like, okay, if you're not sent to heaven, where else are you left to go? Well, the only other place that, ethereal place or whatever you want to describe it is hell or annihilation. One of the two. And I think the Bible describes hell at least being somewhere of a place where you spend some amount of time. Whether that's for eternity, I'm not really sure. Bible's pretty inconclusive on that. But
Yeah.
it's a place prepared for the demons, not prepared for unbelievers. It's just unbelievers end up there for lack of somewhere else to put them almost.
Yeah, I think it's just a place where God demonstrates his justice.
Yeah. And what's
And I
crazy.
this is a side note, this is totally side note, and I don't wanna talk about it, but I hate and this I grew up like this, but I you did too, I guess, but I hate when people say, like, um, God is not present in hell because for whatever reason, and I'm just like, "No, he totally is." The reason why hell is because God is there,
Yeah.
because his justice
Well,
is being,
you know what's
done there.
another crazy thing to think about is heaven and hell are not even places that are created yet.
Yeah. That's
So
true. A
when
lot of people think that, like, Satan is already or demons or whatever, people are already in hell.
no,
And the answer is these places are eternal. So in our
yes.
temporal time span, they're not created, but eternity, it's kind of sticky because they could be. If God is eternal, all moments, past, present, and future, are present to Him. So, but yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's weird. And it's so the problem with like speculating about eternity and heaven and hell is it's just that there's so little biblical data to support any position strongly outside
Mhm.
of there is some type of experience that does last for an eternity that is in the presence of God for believers. That we know for sure.
Right.
But people automatically assume that that is going to be like a great, awesome, pleasant experience for all. When I, at least from what I don't know if I hold this close to my heart, but what I kind of do think is that heaven for those believers who have been unfaithful and kind of worthless believers, like they may believe when they're young and kind of fallen away and don't really think about it. I think that heaven is going to be where they end up, but it's going to be a place of regret or sorrow that they didn't realize or do more with their opportunities. And they won't have any, crowns of righteousness to cast at Jesus' feet. So for them, yes, it'll be an overall positive for them, but it's also going to be a place where they're going to have a lot of remorse. And I think that maybe they obviously won't, I don't think they live in that state for an eternity, but it's going to hit hard when you first get there and realize that you squandered all of your opportunities. And then Tim would
Yeah.
say, "You sound like a Molinist. What do you mean they could decide to do good or they had blah 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 blah. You know what I mean? But
I get what you mean.
yeah,
And yeah, I don't know. I think
I don't know either.
God could claim. I have to study more of it, and I guess
Yeah,
we'll do a podcast when I study it more. But I guess one could say that God doesn't blame anybody, and if that's the case, then the Calvinists could say, yeah, God doesn't praise us apart from the Spirit, and God doesn't even blame us
yeah. It
apart
could,
from the Spirit.
because
So
what is like blame? Like what does that actually
right,
mean? Like you did something morally wrong, but what I see God
usually
doing, what I see God doing is punishing or exacting judgment for when people do something wrong. So it's like it's more of a action and consequence than mere. I guess it would be assigning blame also, but I don't know. I'm getting myself lost now. You know what I mean? Like I see it more as like they do something wrong and God punishes them for it or judges them for it. But does
right,
that mean blame?
right. And I don't know. So
Well,
yeah, I mean the idea is,
think about
yeah,
it.
usually when like God blames wrongdoers, for some of their wrongdoings, but the idea is what is blameworthiness and what is the nature of blame and whether or not humans actually meet that nature of blame. That is all different, right? And if we can come up with an account that somehow, skirts the philosophy of blame, then that means God, we could potentially separate them. We could still be in the wrong, or at least morally responsible for something in which we have reactive attitudes like you shouldn't have done this, indignation, resentment, like those kinds of reactive attitudes bouncing off of our actions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are blameworthy. It just means that we did wrong. So if we can separate the blameworthiness from the wrongdoing, and if we have an account for that, we could apply it to God. And if we have some sort of evidence that that could be plausible, maybe biblically, for God to hold humans non-blameworthy, then I think I think it's fair game.
Well,
But
I
all
do know
speculation,
that like all people are found guilty, right?
right?
So does that mean that if you're found guilty, does that also mean that you're found blameworthy? What is the definition of blameworthy? I just need to look this up. Blameworthy definition: responsible for wrongdoing and deserving of
Grace.
censure or blame, or deserving censure just means severe disapproval. So responsible for wrongdoing and deserving of disapproval.
So
Uh,
I think
responsible
what
for wrongdoing is a weird term to
yeah. So
define
I think there's
biblically.
two different things here. Responsibility, yes, but also what conditions do they satisfy that make us to the point where we can blame that person. So there's two different things. I think it's a conjunction. So when people usually say, "Oh, you're morally responsible for killing that kid," well, what do you mean? Does that mean I'm praiseworthy for killing that kid? Well, no. What they mean is I'm blameworthy for killing the kid. But then that's totally different, right? Because praise and blame don't come in like necessarily, at least, in a dual package. So that means I'm responsible for my action if I kill a kid, right? But I'm also blameworthy for killing a kid, but then how you go about articulating why I'm blameworthy is different than articulating why I'm responsible. Does that make sense?
So your part is you would say, of course, you're responsible for the wrongdoing,
Right.
but are you deserving of severe disapproval?
Right. Yeah. What is the nature of blame? Am I actually blamed? Do I meet those conditions? Yada yada yada. Specifically for God, I may be blameworthy for human to human interaction
Yeah,
because we have set those things in the motion. But I'm
this
more
sounds
concerned
like
about
a wild conversation if you think we're talking about humans. Of course, people are blameworthy. human to
We
human,
hold people blameworthy. That's why we have
all the
prisons,
time, all the
right?
time. But in the eyes of God,
Right.
I'm gonna
It's
do.
maybe different.
But I'm gonna chew on this, and we can maybe talk about it a little bit next time.
You
Because
know
I'm
what? I
gonna.
have an article from a good Calvinist friend of mine, Paul Manata. I've read maybe a couple paragraphs of it, and I can send it to you, and then we can maybe read it together, and then do a whole new episode on divine blame. That'd be totally different from I think our normal kind of spin,
No, that would
but
be cool. And I
it
want
would
to
be
look
cool.
through the. I want to look through the Bible for anything I can find on the concept of blame and God assigning blame. Because isn't there something in Romans 8 or 9 about blame? I just want to look
Um,
really, really quickly.
Romans 9, yeah. Well, that's not blaming humans. That's like humans can't blame God for
I know.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
doesn't meet the conditions for our blameworthiness. And we could also spin it and say, do we meet the conditions of his blameworthiness, of his blame to us? And we could equally, perhaps, that's the question, say no. So both parties are neither blamed, which would be really interesting, I think.
Okay, hold on. Oh no. Is this really what I'm seeing? This is going to take like 2 more seconds. Every single instance of the word blame. Okay, there's a few in the Old Testament, but almost all of them are blameless. So there's only a few instances where the term blame on its own is said, like Genesis 43:9. If I do not bring him back to you and place him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all of my life. And that's Abraham talking. I think that's Abraham talking to another person. That's not something God is saying. Um,
Right.
in 44:32, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame before my father all of my life. That's a servant pledging security for the boy with my father. Like that's another human to human. Deuteronomy 21:8. Do not blame your people Israel, whom you redeem, O Lord. Do not hold them accountable for the bloodshed of an innocent person. Then atonement will be made for bloodshed. So that's a prophet asking God, don't blame your people. My Lord, the 2 Samuel 14:9, my Lord the King, let any blame fall on me and the house of my father. That's another human. And there's only like one other account in the New Testament. It was 2 Corinthians 8:20. We did this in a precaution so that no one should blame us in regard to this generous gift we are administrating. And then in 1 Corinthians 10:30, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I blamed for the food that I give thanks for? That's them eating the meat from sacrifices, which some Jews found abhorrent.
Right.
So it doesn't really say anything about God blaming people like that. It's just not mentioned in the Bible unless there's a different word. I'm using the NET translation, second edition, and I just looked up the word blame. So that is very interesting. That is extremely interesting.
Yeah, I've been kind of pondering it for
Wow.
a month or two because the more I think about it, the more like, I mean, I guess we just intuitively think that when we say you're morally responsible for killing a kid, you're naturally blameworthy for it. But when you piece
In
them together,
God's
piece them
eyes.
apart,
In God's
yeah,
eyes.
in God's eyes, And if you piece them apart, and then if you look at the biblical evidence, it's not exactly clear, I think, apart from just mere intuition alone that we just
Yeah.
want it to be clear. But it's not exactly objectively clear that those two things mean the same thing. And I think that's very intriguing. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so what about foreknowledge did you want to talk about?
Yeah, so foreknowledge, awesome little argument. First, I'm going to just explain something with regards to Molinism and how it connects to Molinism, because I love Molinism, but I think it's false. And then I'll kind of show why, following John Martin Fisher, why I think um, there's incompatibility between human freedom, libertarian freedom, and God's foreknowledge. But a lot of going back to our earlier, because we never really finished the episode last time, but going back to our earlier, I don't know, episode,
Is
I
that the one
guess, right?
we did, but I haven't put up yet, I think. Yeah.
Right. So I explained flickers of freedom and Frankfurt style arguments and blah, 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 and related the theology behind it. And I think that God just is our whole life could be one big fat Frankfurt style example, in the deterministic sense, of course. And I think that we could still be seen as the source. But I
Hold on.
don't argument
Hold
as
on, hold
against
on.
Hap.
You cut out. Just repeat what you just said. Like the last
How far?
like 5 seconds. Not that far.
I use Frankfurt style arguments to show us that I am the source of my action, but not against PAP, which is what they were originally meant to do.
Principles of alternative
As in
possibilities.
right. Principle of alternative possibilities. So, and then I framed it a little bit in terms of the theological debate. And so there's another objection against Frankfurt style arguments or counterexamples or cases that is posed as a dilemma. And the dilemma basically is two horns. It's what we call an indeterministic horn and then a deterministic horn. So it says something like this: if the counterfactual intervener in the Frankfurt style case needs to know what the free creature will do, then the free creature in that case in the actual sequence is actually indeterminate. What does that mean? It means, like, let's just say the counterfactual intervener Black, that scientist who implanted a chip in Jones's brain. Black doesn't know whether or not Jones is going to vote Republican. Black wants him to vote Republican. So he has to wait, Black has to wait to see what Jones will do. And maybe if Jones triggers an involuntary response, like a prior sign, like a blush, or a furrowed eyebrow, or something like that, or maybe it's just even more gross, like
Reaches.
like just kind of twitches with his like little like hands or whatever, and then he votes Republican, whatever. When he sees that prior sign, Black, that's when the mechanism kicks in, the alternative sequence kicks in, and then he makes him vote Republican anyways. The idea is, well, Black doesn't know with certainty that Jones will actually vote Republican. And unless Black actually determines Jones to vote Republican, then the Frankfurt style, in the Frankfurt style example, Jones has indeterministic freedom, which is to say, Pap is not shown false. And I totally buy this. I think there's some cases, like the completely determined case, that evade this dilemma defense, but only if they just first concede that I'm not going to use a Frankfurt style argument against Pap in the first place. So I'm positioning the Frankfurt style argument as against Pap, and if the dilemma defense is posited, either Jones is indeterminate and then Black doesn't know what Jones will do, or he's determined because Black has just determined every feature about him, and then Black does know what he's going to do because he's determined it. Either way, Pap is not shown to be false. I totally get that argument.
Yeah.
How you doing so far? Make sense-ish?
It'll make sense to someone somewhere. Let's go on.
The idea is this, though. Let's just put it into Molinism. I think this will kind of bring it home. The Molinist says God knows what a free creature would do in any circumstance, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say in the dialectical context, I posit a Frankfurt-style example to show that, hey, to the Molinist, I can be determined and yet still the source. I've done that. I kind of explained it in our last episode when you post it. They respond back saying, not so fast. The dilemma defense. Either Jones is indeterminate or determined. And if he's indeterminate, then Pap is true. And if he's determined, well, then Pap is still true, because then you're question begging. You're first assuming that Pap is false, and then Pap is false in order for the argument to go through. I would respond to the Molinist saying that I don't think they can use that exact. I don't think they have access to the dilemma defense here. And this is actually really interesting. So think about it. If the Molinist presses, let's just say, the indeterministic horn or the deterministic horn to the compatibilist, I think both horns end up backfiring. And the reason why is because the indeterministic horn says that if the controller waits till the agent chooses A or B to find out what the agent is going to do, in the Frankfurt-style example, the agent will have alternative possibilities. What that horn demonstrates then is that the controller is not omniscient. So Black is not omniscient. He does not know what the agent would do.
Got him.
But right, so the Molinist wants to say if they press the dilemma defense, and press the flicker of freedom defense all they want. We've already discussed a little bit about that. But if they press the dilemma defense, I don't think they're being consistent here. Because if we're both theists, we're both using Frankfurt-style arguments for, the general how God brings about things, right? And some Molinists do use the dilemma defense. I don't think they're being consistent, because then they would have to say either Black determines what Jones is going to do, but that's just determinism, which they deny. Or that Black doesn't have any idea what Jones is actually going to do, or what he would do, which is why he needs, which is why Jones has alternative possibilities.
Yeah.
So to me, this is like pretty cool, because it at least shows that, yes, the Molinist can still use the flicker defense, which is, to me, way more robust and way more prominent of a defense of Frankfurt-style arguments than the dilemma defense is. But it also shows that I think they're limited on their defenses of the Frankfurt-style, defenses against the Frankfurt-style case. And I think that's really intuitive, and I think that's really cool. So yeah, the Molinists cannot use the dilemma defense, because they would either A, be assuming that Black is a deterministic agent determining Jones to do what he does, and that's how he knows what he would do. That's just determinism. Obviously, Molinism denies determinism. So they can't say that. But then the other horn, they also can't say that, because the indeterministic horn says that the controller has to wait to figure out, literally, in the actual sequence, what Jones would do. Would do. That's their favorite word, Molinist. Would, right?
Would.
But yeah, they can't have that either, because obviously the Molinist God knows what Jones would do in the actual sequence. He doesn't need to wait, right?
Yeah.
And so it's pretty interesting. And that brings us to foreknowledge. But what do you think?
I'm tracking too, because if you really wanted to be, I guess, more accurate with Frankfurt-style cases, to me at least, the mad scientist, who is kind of representing God, I guess, would already know exactly what Jones was going to do, so he would know if the mechanism was needed in the first place. And if it was needed, he would know when to use it. Actually, he wouldn't even know when to use it. He would just use it, because
he would use a mechanism that doesn't override the actual sequence mechanism that doesn't override their agency.
Yeah, you just use it. So, and it's hard, like, because if you follow the assumptions that if you're talking to a Molinist or anyone else, honestly, that holds that God has foreknowledge, then Frankfurt's style cases almost fit really well if we assume that that Black or the scientist is omniscient like God is.
Right.
I don't even think you have flickers of freedom, because the scientist would already know when that was going to happen and act accordingly.
And this is why I wanted to bring the Frankfurt first and then get into foreknowledge, because now we can kind of see a nice framework of foreknowledge. If God knows what I will do this next Saturday, can I do otherwise? Well, there's really one or three possibilities. Either God's past belief could be false. So I can make it the case somehow that I could do otherwise, but then that means God's past belief would be false. But clearly, if he's infallible and if he's omniscient, that can't be the case, right? So God needs to have omniscience in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The other, I want to just read them because I don't want to butcher them. The other, come on. The other one could be, so the first one is Jones can bring it about that God had a false belief at T1. God believed at T1 that I would, let's just say, mow the grass on Saturday. Well, I could either A, bring it about that God had a false belief like in the past, but that seems implausible. Number two, the other option is I could bring it about that God held a different belief from the one he actually held. Well, that also seems kind of implausible, because if God believed that I would mow the grass on Saturday at T1, it comes, let's just say, at T2 on Saturday, and I make it to the case that God has different foreknowledge, like a different set of beliefs than he actually had. And then three, Jones can bring it about that God didn't actually exist. Obviously, three is false. I mean, I can't do that, right? So really, it's just one or two. I don't think it's plausible to say that I can bring it about that God had a false belief, because God is infallible. He never has false beliefs, right? He believes all true propositions. That's part of what makes him omniscient. And so, he knows what I will do.
Yeah.
Notice I'm using will. So part of his free knowledge here. We've already talked about that in the past. But his free knowledge, he knows what I will do on Saturday. Okay. Whether that knowledge is determined, middle knowledge, it doesn't matter. Unless you're an open theist, he knows what I will do pretty much on Saturday. Now, it could be, and this is where the debate comes in, that I could bring it about that God held a different belief than the one he actually held. I don't see how this is plausible. So in other words, here's the argument for foreknowledge, that if God believed that I will mow the lawn on Saturday, he believed in the past, I will mow the lawn this Saturday. Because God is infallible, and because God has perfect omniscience, and he's never wrong, his past belief entails or transfers to my powerlessness. I cannot do other than mow the lawn on Saturday. And if he believed different, then I would do differently. Right? So this is what we call incompatibility between human libertarian freedom and God's foreknowledge. And Calvinists are big proponent of that. They would be compatibilist with regard to moral responsibility and God's determination. That's fine. But they're incompatibilist with regards to human libertarian freedom to do otherwise, or to think or whatever otherwise.
Alternative possibilities.
Right. So you don't have the principle of alternative possibilities if God exists and he is perfectly omniscient and infallible. And I think it's a plausible argument. Now, obviously, I haven't really defended it. I haven't really gotten into the weeds, but
no. You want to know what's funny is this was my first and probably strongest intuition that led me to agreeing with you. Because if you remember at first, like I thought everything you're saying, first of all, was a different language, and second of all, made no sense, and third of all, I didn't agree with. But very quickly, you changed my mind, because in my head, I've always thought this, and I believe our church always taught this, and it's pretty common that God has foreknowledge. God knows everything that will happen. It just was the matter that I didn't think that God could determine all of those things because I didn't have the vocabulary and the mechanisms of all the stuff that I have now, which makes it, I can say that without blaming God or, making him the author of evil, yada, yada. But the intuition I held is that if foreknowledge is true, and I think it is, then how could I do anything other than what God knows I'm going to do? So I've never really at any point in my life thought that I actually had access to alternative possibilities. I've always thought they're theoretically there, and I still think that. But in the actual sequence, to me, there's only one actual sequence that's going to occur, and God knows from the very first event to the very last event, or if you want to spread that out from eternity past to eternity future, he knows exactly in perfect detail without any sort of mistakes what is going to happen. How could I possibly do otherwise than that? I've always thought that. And honestly, if you're any Christian who holds to foreknowledge, I really don't see how you can think that you have alternative possibilities. Well, some people will be like, "Oh, it's a quirk of God's wisdom. He knows all possible futures."
Right.
Which is
No
really the
knowledge.
only way that you could have it. Like he knows all possible things you would do and knows what you will. But to me, like what's the point of God knowing theoreticals outside of serving your philosophical intuition? It would serve no purpose at all for God to know theoretical possibilities outside of holding a theological intuition about libertarian freedom. Like there would be no other reason he would do that. And me being very pragmatic, to me that seems like a lot of dead weight that isn't necessary. God just knows what is and what's going to be. Like it already
Right.
happened.
I think we've already explained why we think the deterministic model of providence is better here. And obviously there's some overlap between omniscience and his providence. And we, or I don't know about you, but at least me, would say God knows because he has determined it. And honestly, this is nothing new. Open theists generally would agree here. They would generally agree and say, yeah, if God determined the whole world, then yeah, of course he knows what he's doing. He would
Yeah.
know everything because he determined everything. It's just the case that they would say that we're not free and responsible because he's determined everything, blah, blah, blah. So they're incompatibilists with regards to freedom and God's determination. So in order to keep freedom, they give up God's exhaustive future foreknowledge, right? But what I really find interesting with this argument is the Molinists, because they are going to, because generally the open theist agrees with us sort of here, and they're going to still claim an incompatibility of libertarian freedom and
Which is
God's
fine.
foreknowledge. It's fine, but the Molinist is going to, specifically the Molinist, some simple foreknowledge, but really the Molinist comes back and tries to argue differently. And this is why I love John Martin Fisher, because he has an article called Putting Molinism in Its Place. And basically he's like, they don't solve the problem of divine foreknowledge and freedom. They presuppose a solution.
Exactly. So it's
So they're
so
like, basically, he's
frustrating.
like, Molina, when he devised Molinism, it's about providence, not about foreknowledge. So we should put Molinism back in its place, put it back in the providential realm about human freedom and God's determination, and how you can be free and God can be sovereign at the same time. That's providence, an issue with providence. But with regards to foreknowledge, Molinism doesn't solve anything. And a lot of Molinists think it does, but it doesn't. And this is so. I'll just quote something from John Martin Fisher. They have presented Molinism, the advocates of Molinism, on par with, say, Ockhamism. And Ockhamism, maybe we'll discuss at a later episode. Very advanced stuff, kind of tricky, but it's similar to doing something such that God could have a different belief than what you would have done. It's kind of like a counterfactual dependence about God's belief in what you do. Basically, all that in defense of PAP, and God's foreknowledge, but we'll get into that later sometime. But the Molinists, try to put it on par of this Occamist solution to divine foreknowledge as a response to the argument for incompatibilism between foreknowledge and human freedom. John Martin Fisher says, but this is incorrect. Molinism represents a helpful and illuminating strategy for understanding divine providence, but it presupposes, without providing a solution to the problem, of the relationship between God's foreknowledge and human freedom to do otherwise. Given that Luis de Molina, assumes that acting freely implies freedom to do otherwise, which he does, he assumes acting freely is just libertarian freedom, the Molinists then, when they posit middle knowledge in response to God's foreknowledge, that dilemma, assumes as part of middle knowledge that God has available to him, prior to his decree, knowledge of a set of conditionals of the following form. In this circumstance, the agent would do this freely, blah, blah, blah. So really, he says middle knowledge just presupposes a problem without actually arguing independently, how do I solve this issue, this dilemma between God's foreknowledge and my libertarian freedom? And he says, and I think rightly, that Molinism just presupposes libertarian freedom. So obviously they're going to find compatibility between them. But that's not the argument. That's not what we should say. I think that's really interesting. Molinists use it all the time. They can't. So
yeah, there's, I don't understand why Molinism is so popular, dude. Or it really isn't. It really isn't. It really isn't actually that popular. I have yet to find somebody in real life that knows what Molinism is.
I think it's mainly people find it intuitive because of the free will defense.
I think it's lazy though, like honestly, because if you work out all the implications, the parts do not match up. Like, how can God have foreknowledge and you be libertarianly free? Oh, God knows what free creatures would do. Like,
yeah, that presupposes a solution.
But remember when we were talking, like I was trying to get you to explain decision making. I was like, what factors go into decision making at blah, blah, blah. Everything is set. Like, given all these factors equals an outcome. But the problem with Molinism is that they suppose the outcome and the factors can be whatever, an infinite amount of different possibilities, right? Like, if you're libertarianly free, then your decisions are going to be an infinite number, not infinite, but a very wide number of reasons. And those decisions are going to lead to a different branching circumstances. And each one of those have different branching circumstances. And it gets a while. You're, 6, 7 decisions deep in your life, at the age of 4 or 5, whatever you want to consider your age of reasoning is, and you already have millions and millions of possible, and that's just like at the very start. By the time the end of your life, there's trillions and billions and billions and trillions and billions of different possibilities and factors that lead to all sorts of different outcomes. And you want to say, oh, God can, in his infinite knowledge and blah, 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 knows all of that. I guess, like, I
just think
because it's always changing. It's always changing.
That, but the problem is they need to argue for it. Now, most, even simple foreknowledge theists want to say, well, why do I need to argue how God knows something? He just knows it, right? Just like, do you argue that God knows, or do you argue that God is omnipotent? He just is omnipotent. You don't argue how God is omnipotent. He just naturally and simply is omnipotent. In the same way, God is naturally and simply omniscient. It's usually the response, at least the layman's response that I get. And the problem with that, and I think, is that they're making a false equivalency between omnipotence, God's essential attribute, and omniscience.
You can give Bible verses for that, though. You can prove that. It's not, I just know. I'm like, well, from Scripture, but I don't know from Scripture that God has middle knowledge. Grounding objection. Like, where does it come from?
Right. There's a lot of philosophical I think let me back up. I think you made a good point because that is one stipulation that I would probably put in as a false equivalency. With foreknowledge and human freedom, or just human freedom in general, a plethora of issues. Just that's why it's called free will is called a classical problem. God's foreknowledge and free will is called a classical problem in philosophy. What about omnipotence? It's not a classical problem
It's
because it
stated.
doesn't relate to us. So his
Yes.
omnipotence is just with him. It doesn't relate to us. How can God be all powerful? Well, we can say, all theists should say, well, he just is. He is all powerful because he is. And whether, there's different theories of his omnipotence and everything, but generally we don't quibble about that crap because we just, it doesn't relate to us.
Hold
But
on.
when it starts relating to us,
Can I cut you off? Permission to
we're going to disagree.
permission to intervene here. You know what? It just hit me when because I was explaining this to my friend before I drove back home. Because he was like, "What's your podcast about?" I'm like, "Well, apparently we're destroying mere Molinism. I don't know what it's supposed to be about though." But he's like, "What's Molinism?" Because nobody knows what Molinism is, like I said in real life. And I was like, "Well, they believe that given libertarianly free creatures, that God peered through the annals of time and was and could see what all these libertarianly free creatures would do, and he actualized the world in which was the best possible outcome given libertarian freedom." Okay, cool, right? That's about, I'm in the ballpark.
Yeah.
So, but what just hit me is when you say God actualizes a world which is the most or the best possible solution. Isn't that the same as God determines the world for the best? God determines the best possible solution given freedom. I know they're not exactly the same, but when God starts to actualize something, is he actual? He's bringing about, okay,
Right.
but is it all? Is it all of history? He's bringing about all of history at that point. So he knows the best possible solution. So there's only, at that point, once it's actualized, there's now only one possible solution.
Right.
Or one possible future, sequence. I guess you could say.
There's one actual sequence of events.
So if Molinism is saying that once that decision made at the beginning of time considers all possibilities given freedom to the end of time, if that's the block that we have, they're admitting right there that they don't have access to alternate possibilities, because at that point, if God actualizes it, then it can be, the road is set. It's done. There's no alternative possibilities. He actualized it.
So obviously they're going to say, and I don't find these sayings convincing, but they're going to say like, well, I could actually do otherwise. But I kind of tongue in cheek say, you're not Mario. You can't bounce possible worlds. You could do that. You could do that before God's creation.
Yeah.
You can bounce possible worlds through actualizing whatever you did. But then once he's actualized in this sequence, after the creative decree, you can't bounce to world 1 and do otherwise. You can't bounce to world 2 and do otherwise. You're in world 100, and whatever God saw that you would do in world 100, you will do
here exactly. And here's my like frustration with it, is because if you want to say it's all of time, he actualizes the front or the beginning and the end, actualized, done. Okay, you don't have access to alternative possibilities. You might as well, God actualizes, God determines. To me, I'm like, same thing. It's the same outcome. You have freedom, but you don't have access to alternative possibilities, yet you're still morally free or morally responsible. But if they want to say God is actualizing as events unfold, you're an open theist.
That's true.
Which is it? Are you a determinist or an open theist? Like, it doesn't that make sense though? Like, they want to explain it that way, but you're like adding like an extra step for the sake of preserving libertarian freedom, but it equals the exact same outcome.
Right.
Either way you slice it.
There's one scenario in which I see them. So actually in the last episode, which you will air eventually, we went through a Frankfurt case called Stump's Frankfurt case, and it was really elaborate. And in that essay, her essay was called Moral Responsibility Without Alternative Possibilities. So she is a Frankfurt style case. I disagree with her, and we already know that I disagree with Frankfurt style cases because of the flicker defense and blah blah blah. But she actually concedes somewhere in that essay. It's actually really cool. She says that her case is compatible with Molinism. And a lot of Molinists, specifically William Lane Craig, maybe you've heard of him before, but William Lane Craig, William Lane Craig does take something very similar where you can be morally responsible and free without having alternative possibilities. Here's the problem that I try to do in my volume 1 is you can't claim libertarian freedom then.
Yes.
Because libertarian freedom to me necessarily entails indeterminism. Okay, so what these philosophers like Stump, Craig want to say is, oh, you can be indetermined, you couldn't do otherwise. But you can indeterminate, nothing causally determines you, coercively determines you to do what you do. That's what they're thinking. And that's why in the actual sequence of a Frankfurt style example, they're saying, see, Jones is free. We agree with Frankfurt. He's not determined like the alternative scenario. He's doing everything on his own accord, but he couldn't do otherwise. Libertarian freedom? Yes, yes. And I'm saying no, no, because libertarian freedom entails indeterminism, and definitionally, indeterminism entails alternative possibilities. If determinism entails one possible future, guess what indeterminism just by negation entails?
Multiple.
More than one future. And so you have to have more than one open path if you claim indeterminism. So this is where I think those Frankfurt libertarians, what they call them, Stump, Craig, or whatever, or a Molinist who wants to say this, they want to have indeterminism, but yet no alternative possibilities. And I'm saying that's incoherent. How about this? Just claim compatibilism and everything goes fine. The idea is with determinism, they think, I honestly think this is the case. I wish I could prove it, but I honestly think it's the case that people that are against determinism think that it's just God moving pawns across a chessboard directly with efficient causation every single time. And they think it's the alternative sequence, like God coercing human beings to do what they do, like puppets, right? That, I think, is what Stump and other Frankfurt libertarians are thinking, which is why they're gravitating towards something that's not deterministic foreknowledge or whatever, or compatibilist freedom. But I think all of that goes away when we truly understand what determinism is and what it is not. Once we understand that it doesn't, in fact, by itself, eradicate freedom in any specific sense of the word, and we can truly be reasons responsive, have guidance, control, and all that, then when you claim a Frankfurt style argument, what you should be claiming is something like compatibilism that pops out, not indeterminism. And what they want to say is their own source, like, well, Jones did it by himself. Right. But I think that Jones couldn't do otherwise, which is just to say Jones was determined to do otherwise. And if you say, which I have had people say to me before, but if they say, well, that's just presupposing determinism and no one says that, false. Robert Cain, prominent libertarian philosopher, he says exactly verbatim what I just said, that he's either determined or it's open. So Jones is either determined and has no alternative possibilities, or it's indeterminate and it's open. Again, open theism, determinism. Like, I don't think you can really get around that. And this is the issue that I have a lot with Molinists.
And I really feel like the reason that people hold on to things like Molinism or even Arminianism at this rate, I know we talk about Molinism a lot, but a lot of the faults of Arminianism can be equated to Molinism also. Like they have a lot of the same issues. Molinism is just a lot more obvious about their problems, I think. But it feels like a reaction to what atheists would say when in regards to evangelism and salvation and God determining. Because if you just say that outright without explaining what you mean, then you can get yourself in hot water with atheists really quickly. But if you have, oh, free will, it's just, how did evil come out? Well, free will. Freely, intuitionally, it makes sense. Biblically, there's not a whole lot in your face arguing with you on that.
Right.
Me and you would describe it the same way, like pretty closely. It's easier. It's just not. I don't want to say it's intellectually dishonest, because I think these people legitimately think that, obviously.
I think it's what Manuel Vargas has called theistic Runeberging. What that means is it's motivated reasoning.
Yeah, exactly.
And whether it's unintentional or intentional, it doesn't matter. It's motivated reasoning. And he has a wonderful article in the book Freewill and Theism by Tempe and Speak in 2016, and awesome article. And he literally goes in and explains exactly what you said. That many